You want to empower black people in the workplace? You want to fight back against racism? Democratize the workplace and give everybody an equal say. Let the black worker have more than just a boss that they have to listen to in a rigid hierarchy. Give the black worker direct control over their labor.
So there's been a fairly big shift on political commentator YouTube, with a lot of established left-leaning creators essentially becoming more right-wing, people like Jimmy Dore, who I'm not really going to talk about today. And of course, in the past, you had liberals like Dave Rubin completely selling out. But something that's really concerning me specifically is people like Kyle Kulinski, Krystal Ball, and other people like this, who are essentially buying into a lot of the right-wing framing of certain cultural issues. A lot of people call these people class reductionists, and there's a lot of credibility to that term, because while they often acknowledge very real problems with race in society or how trans people are discriminated against, their solutions to these problems are often based in universalism, in that they somehow think, and I've seen people like Ben Burgess, and he deleted the tweet, I quote tweeted him at the time, basically saying there's no need for ethnic studies, just give people healthcare. As if in countries where there's universal healthcare, like where I grew up, the United Kingdom, that basically eliminates racism. Or if there's better worker protection, the UK compared to the US, that basically eliminates racism. The UK was not even founded as a racist state, and it still had loads of racism in society. In my opinion, if you don't specifically tackle racism as a separate issue from often economic things, then you aren't really going to get anywhere. Because sure, if you improve everyone's economic situation, if you give people universal healthcare, UBI, all these different things, maybe they will be less susceptible to scapegoating minorities for their problems, which is very, very common for the right wing to often do. But the belief that this somehow eliminates racism that was created 600 years ago and is deeply ingrained in Western society is just totally ridiculous. And the fact that people like this somehow believe people like me are woke and we're leading, the left astray by even talking about these things. I don't know why these people can't walk and chew gum. Yes, things like universal healthcare will help everyone, and it will help marginalized communities as well, but it's not the answer to everything. So anyway, what we're going to do in this video is go through some select Kyle Kulinski videos and outline my problems with this approach to politics. And while some of you guys might think it's a better strategy electorally, and that is up for debate, I still think you can push a good electoral strategy while also targeting things that will help alleviate discrimination in society. Now, I don't want to really leave anything out, so I'm going to demonetize this video on purpose. So if you want to support me continuing my work, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting access to the private patrons Discord server and also my Nintendo Switch friend code. Also, because a lot of you need reminding, you tell me if you like the video when you're watching it, please leave a like and maybe a comment with your thoughts. It really helps the video out. And if you want to check out my social medias, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. If you want to join my community, check out the Discord in the description. And if you want to catch up on my old live streams, the Kavernacle Extra is my second channel. That is where my live streams are archived. Now, I think it's important before we go in, and I'm going to be very critical of people like Kyle and Krystal, to make the point that it's perfectly okay to like his content. While I was researching this video, watching various videos that I'm not even going to talk about in this specific video, I found myself agreeing with a lot of his takes. I don't think he's the worst political commentator out there. I don't think he's the worst person to listen to. You can like him and like me at the same time. There's no problem with that. The only interaction I've ever had with him has been a positive one, in that last year my YouTube channel was permanently demonetized based on some sort of mass flagging campaign by the right wing, and he quote tweeted my tweet telling YouTube to reverse it, which is very helpful because he has a lot of followers and he is verified on Twitter, so they will see that notification. So that was very good of him, and he really hates what he sees as corporate censorship in general, although I don't really agree with his definition of corporate censorship in some ways. So yeah, massive thanks to that and a massive shout out to him. So now I want to get into my criticism of him. This isn't just like a random video. Someone actually did leave a comment in one of my other videos last week telling me, you know, what is up with Kyle Kulinski, what's his problem. I'm not really going to go into the drama, like his kind of falling out with TYT and Cenk over him, like really hitching himself to Jimmy Dore while Jimmy Dore's gone like totally insane right winger. But most of these clips are taken from the last year or 2 years. So to start with, I want to talk about this video on the 29th of April 2021, study Identity Politics Kills Progressive Popularity. So basically in the video, he talks about a study that talks about how framing stuff in a race-neutral way is often better electorally. About 5 minutes in, he talks about like people supporting this more, and women and minorities will benefit from pursuing race-neutral policies that are like universal and will benefit everyone.
You're convincing fewer people or turning people against you, whereas if you discuss it in a race-neutral way, even though you're bringing about racial justice, people will support it largely because you're framing it in a race-neutral way. Give another example. This one will be on women's issues. The minimum wage. And actually, I think this works for minority communities as well. If you raise the minimum wage to a living wage, the biggest beneficiaries of that, women and minority communities. Now, what the Democrats are doing these days is they'll go out there and say, because we need to bring about racial justice, and because we care about our black and brown brothers and sisters, and because we're feminists, and because we care about women's issues, that's why we need to do this policy. Although a lot of them don't support $15 minimum wage, but that would be the argument they would make. Whereas, again, the point of this paper is, if you just say, raise the minimum wage to a living wage, because people who work full-time should make enough money to survive, you know, and if the minimum wage kept up with what it was in 1968, it would be over $10 an hour today, so it's worth less today than it was in 1968. If you talk about these things in a race-neutral way, you get more support for this, and the end result could be justice on women's issues and justice for black and brown people.
So in about 8 minutes, he goes on to say, the more you stress the universalism, the more you can appeal to the electorate.
So the more you stress how everybody's in the same boat and we're all together and we take a universal approach, you know, we're all in this together. The more you stress that, the more you highlight the areas where we have common experiences and interests, shock, the more likely you are to win, the more likely you are to get more people on your side.
So we can argue about the merits of that, but you can already see like the class reductionism in here a bit. Now, getting on to a point, this is maybe something he would label me. He goes on to say he doesn't want the left to be obsessed with being an edgy subculture, talking about like ACAB and talking about like turning off the majority of the country, and talks about universal policies benefiting racial injustice more, and that's the most important thing.
One of the main things that I care about on this show is to try to make it so that the left is not obsessed with being an edgy little subculture group, because I actually care about winning and I actually care about getting our policies implemented. So what that means is we need to adjust, we need to be strategic, we need to be intelligent, we need to know what to do and when to do it, what to say and when to say it. And if you want to be an edgy subculture group, by all means, that's your prerogative. Then you use whatever slogans you want, you use whatever approach you want. But my point is just don't expect to win and don't expect to actually get your stuff implemented if that's the route you go. And, you know, so, I mean, again, another great example is if you want to do the ACOB stuff, all cops are bastards, and you want to do like the defund the police stuff, that might make you feel good in your little subgroup. And you might think as a matter of principle, this is something I support or whatever it might be. But you're turning off the overwhelming majority of the country if you say stuff like that. And you're turning off the overwhelming majority of the country if you put race before class and before a universal approach.
And he does later acknowledge we also do need to fix the racial problems, but he downplays how much we need to focus on that rather than focus on the universal problems.
Now again, that doesn't mean that every race issue is solved if you fix the class problem and you have universal programs, but it does mean a lot of them are. It definitely means a lot of them are. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Okay, so we do have to address the other issues that are racialized. We do have to address them, the ones that aren't fixed by a class and universal approach. We're going to have to address them on their own merit and fix it on its own merits. We have to do that, but just understand that you do bring about a lot more racial justice just by doing the universal approach and the class approach, which turns out benefits everybody as well.
So this isn't like the worst video for this stuff, but I wanted to use this at the start to sort of frame Kyle's content for people who don't really know about it and to frame his political positions. Because like I said, you can see there, he feels like the best approach to getting things done and getting people elected who like share your politics is pushing universal policies, is getting everyone to vote on these things because they're largely popular. And do not get bogged down in the culture war, do not get bogged down in identity politics, as loads of right-wingers also love to talk about. Don't focus on those things. Only focus on economic stuff, because when you do that, it benefits everyone. Want to end the war on drugs? Well, that benefits everyone, including minorities who historically, disproportionately, are the victims of that. Universal healthcare will help the most poor in society, and that's how you fix the racial problems. But I do find it interesting how when he talks about race problems specifically, he doesn't really offer any solutions. Like, are we supposed to not make people uncomfortable? For example, let's talk about reparations for African Americans. How can you talk about reparations, which would include billions of dollars over the whole of the United States? How do you talk about that without talking about race and making people uncomfortable? And we can say like universal healthcare like helps minorities and stuff, but then how do you get rid of medical racism? Like, that's something ingrained in the United States. And if you had universal healthcare, medical racism would not go away because of the inherent racist society still not allowing people to get into like higher education, become doctors, take on the debt they need to become doctors, because that is something you would have to target specifically. And to someone like Kyle, maybe that's like a culture war issue. But these things exist outside the realms of class and the economy. It's ingrained prejudices that we all have, especially white people growing up in a fundamentally white supremacist society, because I know a lot of people would like to disagree on this. Racism is about the white supremacist power structure. Now, bigotry, discrimination, those things all exist, but the history of racism from European colonialism till today is a history of a white supremacist power structure. And I like to throw this diagram up for people who don't even believe this exists. For example, this is how the Spanish used to organize their plantations when they got to the New World. So here you see the Spanish, people who were born in Spain, are at the top. People who are African are at the bottom, and in between you have various other different groups of people. You have people who are half black, half native, you have the natives, you have Spanish people who were born in the New World. This is not something that existed in a vacuum. This is something that went across the whole of Europe. And I've also spoke before about the racialization of Anglo-Saxon and how the British often put themselves above other white groups like the Spanish, like the Irish, and the Germans used to do this as well. Hitler said that the English were fellow Anglo-Saxons. Racial prejudices do not get eliminated by people having better economic situations. That's just the fact. So now I want to go to the next video, and they bring on this guy to talk about the post-Occupy left. Now, this guy essentially starts talking about how the left now is being ruined by identity politics and cancel culture and woke and all this garbage. As the title says, the left has abandoned class for wokeness. This guy's an author called Michael Levitin, who wrote a book about Occupy Wall Street, and he starts off the video at 1:30 talking about the culture wars and cancel culture and talking about the identity politics of the 1960s, and that this essentially excluded white people.
You know, there's all this effort now to basically identify who you're allowed to care about, who you're allowed to work with, who you're allowed to have in the coalition. And I think that's I think it's a huge barrier to having the kind of, cross race, cross class solidarity that is absolutely essential to any sort of left populist movement actually being effective.
I agree. And I think what you're skirting around and kind of dancing around language-wise is the culture, is the culture wars and the identity politics and the cancel culture and you name it. Yeah, look, I can't speak enough. I teach journalism now at a community college. I'm in the academic world. I see and am kind of part of that, not to mention as a journalist and in the media. I think that the left, the deeper it goes, and again, this isn't new, right? It started in the 60s. It started with let's not focus on real bread and butter economic issues that impact everyone. Let's divide, let's focus on the people, this group, and let's focus on, and it's all legitimate, of course. Let's, Latino, Latin American people, Native American people, African American people, women, of course, and then, and gay movements, all these movements that created the modern left, this alliance, this mass alliance.
Mm-hmm.
But who did that leave out, and who does it continue to leave out is your, in the 40s to 50% of the population of the country, which is white people, and many of them working class people who are also deeply in debt, deeply struggling, deeply angry, hated, as you said, watching the bank bailouts and what Obama did and how Washington capitulated. I mean,
well, and let's be clear, a lot of working class people of all races feel left out by that politics.
I was just going to say, I reject the framing, because when you look at polling on these issues that we're talking about, remember?
Now, Kyle and Krystal do both reject like the exclusion of like white people and white working class people, but I think this is like the types of people who operate in these groups. They think like the only people who are working class are like salt of the earth, white miners or something in West Virginia. Not that often some of the most poor working class people in like the UK, for example, are black workers in London or Birmingham, or people from like Pakistan and Bangladesh. They're not like from coal mining families in like Wales. They're not white people who used to work in steelwork. So this notion that the working class can't be like non-white working like service jobs in a city is totally ridiculous and needs updating for people like this. I also find it funny he's talking about the 1960s and identity politics. Let me think about a group who started their fight for equal rights in the 60s. Oh yeah, the LGBT community at Stonewall, who beat the shit out of policemen. Do you think that was popular? Do you think a lot of people would agree with that? Sometimes you just have to stand up for your rights, and fighting for your rights isn't going to be popular. These people all think you need to do stuff that's electorally sound. Well, lots of people in their time, Martin Luther King was hated. Most Americans didn't support the Vietnam War protesters at all. Most Americans supported the war. You just do these things because you believe in them, and maybe over time, luckily, attitudes will change. But if you don't have these people doing things and things are unpopular, then nothing's going to change. But to class reductionist people like these guys, they seem to think if you get bogged down in woke and cancel culture and talk about identity politics, you're losing the battle. We'll tell that to the people at Stonewall who fought the police, and the Stonewall organization has gone on to become like one of the most influential. So then later on, they all talk about how Bernie Sanders, who went for like a more universal approach, went on Fox News and stuff, he was essentially nailed for racism.
Main point is it's about subtraction and not addition. It's about, look, we don't want a certain kind of person amongst us. The left used to be about purity of policy. Now, at least in Strands Online, it's about purity of character. And I got bad news for you. If you want to create a movement around purity of character, we're all fucked.
Yeah,
Because
none of us is going to qualify.
Not a single one of us is going to get through a purity test on character. Are you kidding me?
Even Bernie, who, as you say, had such a, he's unbendable over decades and decades of his support on the issues, right? Unbendable. And yet he got nailed on really kind of, on race, that he wasn't enough speaking to the black population, or that he wasn't attentive to everyone. And he tries to be utterly speaking to everyone and pluralistic.
He got arrested protesting segregation.
Right.
Is that not the debate ender?
Now again, I find this quite curious that the video is titled How the Post-Occupy Left Abandoned Class for Wokeness. I don't remember any left-wing people calling Bernie Sanders a racist. They're talking about liberals, but again, I don't know too much about these guys' politics in that. Is Kyle an anti-capitalist? Is Krystal an anti-capitalist? Are these people socialists? In my mind, they're not coming across that way if they're putting the left in with people who thought Bernie Sanders was a racist. The only people who thought Bernie Sanders was a racist were liberals and conservatives, not leftists. So then this guy goes on to talk about how we should like drop the identity politics and deliver on like a unified front.
You know what? Let's not focus on identity politics. Let's drop all that. That's why it's the taboo subject. That's why I'm not quite sure how the left deals with it, which is why I said that if somebody tones down the rhetoric from the right and actually speaks to these issues, but doesn't fool with all that, doesn't get distracted, they have a better chance of actually building a mass movement. Because I think a lot of people on the left and center left, maybe not the hardline activists on the left who just really want every language and every bit of, your rhetoric to sort of fall in place, and it has to make everyone sort of horizontal. That's not where most people are. But if the left can't get that in its head, I don't know how you organize, because like you said, you don't go very far when it's about character. We all have flaws. We all say things, and we can't be pure, but the left sort of demands it.
But again, like bringing up the 1960s example, then talking about like dropping the identity politics, in my mind is very, very ironic. Like civil rights groups were made up of like middle class white people, poor black people, wealthier black people. It wasn't necessarily a class movement. Of course, that was very, very strong, but it was mainly about identity politics. It was, I want racial equality for black people. And of course, that goes hand in hand with capitalism and how unfair capitalism is in America. But at the same time, it also is an acknowledgement that just general people have to acknowledge their racial bias and treat black people equally. I don't think you can have true justice for marginalized groups if you don't talk about identity politics alongside the class stuff. So this video was probably like the most shocking one, and probably the one I have the biggest problem with. He made this video called The White Fragility Hustle on the 8th of July 2020, and it was about the book by Robin DiAngelo. Now, I haven't read this book. I have been reading before I made this video about what a lot of people have been saying about this book, and a lot of black academics saying it's like very, very condescending, and it's white women writing a book and giving lectures about like unconscious bias in white people and everything like that. It's not really had place, and they don't really like it. And there's been a lot of critics of the book. I haven't read it. I don't really care about Kyle's own criticisms of this. But I think in this video, while he's ranting about this stuff, he really goes mask off and shows how class reductionist he is, essentially saying the way to solve racism for black workers is to give them worker co-ops.
You want to empower black people in the workplace? You want to fight back against racism? Democratize the workplace and give everybody an equal say. Let the black worker have more than just a boss that they have to listen to in a rigid hierarchy. Give the black worker direct control over their labor. You really want to fight back against this stuff? You could argue that inherent hierarchy is unfair to the black workers and the white workers who have the boss lording over them. One way to fight back against it. You want to do that? Oh, you don't want to do that. Interesting. I mean, listen, there's a disproportionate effect on black people and on minorities with our low minimum wage. Those communities are more impacted by the low minimum wage than white communities, disproportionately speaking. You want to address that? How about the lack of healthcare? That's a huge problem in communities of color. Single-payer healthcare system helps fight back against that.
So let's run this scenario out quickly. So if every workplace in America became a worker co-op, if there was universal healthcare passed and all that stuff, do you think that would eliminate racism? Do you actually even think that would significantly decrease racial prejudices in people? Honestly, I don't think it would. Like I said, I feel like a lot of people would stop scapegoating like migrants from non-white countries and things like that. I don't believe that racial prejudices would decrease with people's economic situation existing. Like, you can have a worker co-op. How does that eliminate racism in the workplace? Because the people who would be in the worker co-op with you would still have their ingrained prejudices if you didn't tackle this stuff. Now, Kyle goes on to say, like, books like this make like white people feel like crap and like feel like they're responsible for racism, and it really turns them off the racial fight. Now, I want to get into this little part where he talks about the race problem isn't an interpersonal issue because there's only a handful of open bigots, and it's only a systemic problem, and people who didn't see race at all now will have a backlash if you start like lecturing them about white guilt and white fragility.
She's not talking about new laws that need to be passed. She's not talking about structural systemic problems that we just outlined. She's focusing on, hey, just feel like for being white and always, have white guilt and always check yourself and monitor your privilege. That's really what the idea is. What you get is somebody scolding you to feel like if you're white and to be ever vigilant and monitor yourself. The race problem in this country is not an individual interpersonal issue. You could say that the handful of open bigots and racists who are left, for them it is, but that's a very tiny percentage. In terms of everyday people, no. The race problem is not an individual interpersonal issue. It's a systemic problem, and it requires systemic change. And no amount of self-monitoring or white guilt is going to change that. That these diversity training courses, which are her wheelhouse, are total nonsense, don't change anything, and if anything, have a backlash effect, make people who maybe really did kind of not care and not see race at all feel some sort of resentment now because you're forcing them to focus on the issue and feel like shit because they're told, you got all these problems and you're racist and you're inherently bad. Of course there's going to be a backlash to that.
Now, people can say they don't see race and they don't see color, but they do see race and do see color. Race is a social construct which has been put on our societies by mainly white racists back in the day, but it's something we still have in society today. You can't just say, I don't see color. And I spoke about my own experience of this stuff before. Any white person who grows up in Western society will have inherent prejudices and bigotry against various marginalised groups. And even myself, I went to school in a very diverse area. I went to Catholic primary and I went to Catholic secondary school. In England, a lot of Catholics, especially in cities like London, aren't originally from England. So I'm third generation Irish. A lot of people I went to school with were Polish, Indian, they were Africans from like Nigeria, or their families had migrated here like 20 years prior and stuff like that. So I was in like a melting pot of a school, but even I say, like, with the war on terror brainwashing that I grew up with, people like Sam Harris and like Christopher Hitchens previously, their message about Islam became quite appealing to me, but only later did I realise essentially what they were pushing on me was Western chauvinism, which is a racist view of the world in which like Muslims and Arabs are like backwards people and the West is oh so superior and that's something we should preserve. I believe I was susceptible to that despite growing up in a very diverse area and knowing loads of people who weren't from the same background as me, because I was brainwashed by the media to feel like the Middle East and Islam and all these different things was just like inherently violent. Since I was a kid, all I saw on the news, which I used to love watching the news, was war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, 7/7, 9/11, all these different terror attacks across Europe. That's all I saw, and that influenced my thinking growing up. Thankfully, when I was like 20, like I broke out of that like edgy atheist phase and realized how full of shit these guys were. I'm happy enough to admit that, but it's very, very hard for people to admit that, because if you say I had some racial prejudice growing up or I'm still working through it, you feel like you'll be ostracized. But I think people are actually a lot more accepting than you think if you actually admit you're dealing with these problems, instead if you're someone like Joe Biden telling black people they're not black, or you have loads of black friends. I think it's a massive red flag if someone gets really, really butthurt about someone pointing out like white fragility, because it's not your fault. If you're a white person who grows up in an institutionally racist country, that is going to have some impact on you, whether you want to admit it or not. The best way to combat that is listen to like black voices or minority voices and recognize your own privilege and recognize your own bias. Not that you're a terrible person, because you're not. Like I said, it's not your fault. But people like Kyle getting really butthurt about people pointing this out and saying that it will turn the non-racists into racist because they're also butthurt is totally ridiculous. People need an education on how their own personal racism is a byproduct of the systemic racism and how you can combat that. It's not mutually exclusive. Kyle seems to think that only systemic racism exists and there's only a handful of bigots out there, and that is not true at all. So for the final video, I want to include this one. It's relatively new, I guess. October 22nd, 2021. Netflix employees walk out over Dave Chappelle's special and list demands, and this one is with Krystal Ball as well. Now this one's another instance where they show like their own like class reductionism here. The weirdest thing and through line in this video is Kyle keeps comparing his mum not liking the way Italians are presented in The Sopranos and comparing that to how trans people don't like how Dave Chappelle talks about them in the special.
Even if I grant them all of their points that it's horribly bigoted or whatever, which I don't necessarily agree with, I still would keep it up because the intent was not that, and that matters massively. It's the example I always use is that The Sopranos is widely viewed as one of the greatest shows of all time, if not the greatest show of all time. And there are parts of it that are horrifically racist. And, you know, it's, to my knowledge, it's not like the NAACP came out and said, you must pull this down now, and nobody should be able to watch it. No, I mean, they're, you know, they want you to get like pre-approval from people who might be offended. Now, listen, I have to say, you know, I come from an Italian family.
Yeah.
My mom just started watching The Sopranos not that long ago, actually, because she wants to watch the new one.
She's very offended.
One of the comments she made, I'm not kidding about this, one of the comments she made to me is, the way they portray Italians, I don't really like. So if she was in charge of determining whether or not The Sopranos gets on Netflix,
Whole thing gets
she might vote no because she's like, it's making my people look bad. And I'm sorry, I got to say it, but I look at that and I go, hey, Mom, www.shuddy.com, not interested in that. It's a great show. And so I don't want to be an asshole, but I kind of have to say the same thing to this community.
I really need to explain how being transgender and Dave Chappelle saying bigoted things about you on his comedy special is far different than The Sopranos, which mainly features Italian actors playing Italian gangsters, one of the most lauded shows of all time, one of the most beloved shows of all time. Just because your mum doesn't like it isn't the same, because first of all, Italians in America these days, not always, aren't discriminated against by and large. Italians have institutional power. Italians, by most people, are just seen as white. Unless you're super racist, like the people who tell me I'm not white in the YouTube comments, it surprisingly happens a lot. Italians basically like look like me, and no one's going to tell you you're not white, and you're not discriminated against. And The Sopranos, in my mind, despite dealing with a lot of really like awful issues, it has so much charm to it. I think by and large it makes people like Italian Americans more. Although it does play into like, you know, loads and loads of stereotypes about Italian Americans, you love these characters, and I think it's a positive representation of like family, food, and just like Italian migrant culture. So in this news story, the protesters listed their demands and what they want Netflix to do. Now, these people seem to think that transgender employees of Netflix should think a lot bigger, and this isn't really an issue. You know, your employer who exploits your labor to enrich themselves is paying loads and loads of money to get exclusive content in which a comedian says bigoted stuff, gets a massive pass for it, including from Kyle and Krystal, who give him a big pass of this, saying that he didn't intend to be bigoted, therefore he's not bigoted on these issues. And like I said in my video on the topic back in October, the absolute normalization of being bigoted towards transgender people does result in direct harm, and you can't just play it off as like, oh, well, my mum didn't like The Sopranos and she's Italian, so you've just got to suck it up. So this is something they always do. Kyle has done it throughout this video as well, so Krystal's going to do it as well. Basically, she is saying they shouldn't be protesting this stuff because their demands don't really matter. If Netflix accepts their demands and gives in to all of them, it doesn't change anything, where there are actually real issues that transgender people should focus on. So don't waste your time with your employer who controls most of your life. Actually go out and protest for like trans healthcare or against trans suicide and everything like that, because that's important.
Okay, I have a little bit of a counterintuitive take on the list, which is I actually think the list is asking too little. And what I mean by that is these are exactly the kind of box checking diversity things that companies do all the time to avoid having to make any real changes that are actually going to substantively change like the reality for oppressed communities. I mean, to have a one person on the board, to have some fund, to throw $10 million at some creative pipeline or whatever, all this stuff is easy for them. It's box checking. And so in a sense, like, here's my broader point is I think that the idea that you would invest your precious time and resources in protesting Dave Chappelle instead of the many other like trans rights that you could be focused on that would have a systemic change across the country, that's hard for me to understand. It's very surface level. It's very sort of just like focused on the the box checking sort of like content-free identity level stuff versus the fact that, yeah, there's a massive problem with trans suicide, massive problem with, trans people are disproportionately low on the economic scale. Like there are huge systemic problems here. And it seems to me like your focus is on the most surface level stuff that if Netflix checks all of these boxes, it's not going to actually change anything.
So these people think workers who are protesting might not also be inclined to actually protest other issues. If they're so passionate to protest Dave Chappelle's bigotry, do you not think they might have participated in some form of other activism? I probably think a lot of them might have. But even if they haven't, right, this is your employer. Let's change it around. Imagine this is like, I don't know, a conservative comedian who is making insanely racist jokes about black people, and black employees of Netflix go out and protest. I don't think you'd be saying this stuff. But for somehow, even for these people, when it's trans people, it shouldn't be a big deal. They should protest the real issues. If your employer is paying for exclusive rights for a comedian to say this stuff, you are totally well within your rights to feel very, very aggrieved. And I support your right to protest 100%, and I think you're in the right. Not only are Netflix exploiting these trans employees, they're also making them feel awful and pushing normalized bigotry around the globe with these Netflix specials. I think any worker who cares about how they're treated would support these trans employees protesting like this, not dismiss it and say, well, they should protest something that matters. Now Kyle has like a really, really bad take where he says when groups have been historically oppressed, they lash out and ask for like disproportionate treatment.
I think one of the things that happens is that historically, when a group really is not equal in any serious sense, and they're sort of looked down upon, and they've had it rough for a long time. I think what happens is this backlash effect, and there's like an overcompensation for the fact that for the longest time they were really looked down upon. And in many ways, there's still a lot of issues there. The black community was so put down for so long that there was this backlash of like, burn the whole thing down. And I think you're sort of seeing that with the trans community where, you know, people finally have a voice. You've democratized the public square in a sense, like Jon Stewart said. So now they're like, well, here are all of our demands, and this is what we want.
So this is like a really, really ridiculous take, because transgender employees of Netflix weren't asking for like the moon or anything. They were just asking for enough funding to be put in place to promote trans creators more. Is that really like a massive backlash? Like, come on, that's an awful take. Then he goes on to echo what Krystal says and says that transgender employees of Netflix should fight for real issues because Biden can solve them with an executive order. Why aren't they protesting Biden? That's what would be politically smart.
But to your point, the thing that I can't get over is, yeah, like there are real problems. One of the biggest problems is trans people are not a protected class. And so what that means is in over 20 states in the country, you can get fired if you're trans, and the boss can literally say, I'm firing you because you're trans. I'm uncomfortable with it. I think it's weird. I either don't want to hire you, I'm going to fire you because you're trans. Get out of my store. You're a weirdo. I don't like the way you look. That's still legal in this country. That's a real civil rights fight. So if you take all of this energy and you channel it towards, Biden could probably fix that with an executive order because Congress has the power of the purse. So it has to go through there if there's money being spent on it. There's no money spent on this if it's an anti-discrimination clause.
Right.
So why are you not protesting Biden to fix that scenario? For the life of me, I don't understand.
Yes, Biden, who's shown himself to be a great champion of transgender rights, would definitely pass executive orders to protect them if they protested him. But also, they could do both of those things. Like, they could protest Biden and protest Netflix. I don't know why these people think it's mutually exclusive. Now, bouncing off, like, the politically smart thing, they then go on to say, like, they don't know how widespread the sentiment is around the country.
To see how many employees, and dozens. Out of Netflix employees, 9,000 people.
Oh, they have 9,000 employees? That's a lot of
9,000 full-time employees. Now, that's globally. So, look, and I think some were planning on participating in some kind of virtual walkout, so we don't know. So, we also don't know how widespread the sentiment actually is within Netflix and the Netflix workers, we should also say.
Even in the country, too, I'd be curious.
I would be curious as well. Because ultimately, like, to get 100 people or a couple hundred people in California, whether this was in LA, is that right?
I don't know.
Let's see. In LA is, it's not massive. So
I'm bringing it back to the Stonewall protest again, because why are these people so obsessed with optics all the time? Like, is it going to get your racist uncle in Virginia to vote for these policies? Sometimes it doesn't matter. How many people in the US do you think would support what happened at Stonewall in the 1960s? How many people do you think would have supported that? How many people supported the Black Panthers lunch programs? How many people supported Martin Luther King when he came out against the Vietnam War? How many people have supported like loads of marginalized groups standing up for themselves? The majority of Americans have not supported that stuff. Are you saying because it's not like optically good and they can't get like electoral reform passed that they shouldn't do that? And that's the problem with these guys as well. They literally think of everything just in terms of like elections and getting people in Congress or getting people in the Senate. That's not the be-all or end-all of politics, and that's not the be-all or end-all of activism. You can do many things outside of this stuff without thinking, what do the bigots think? Let me bow down to the coal miners in West Virginia and never mention identity politics so I can get them to vote for something in their self-interest. That's not going to solve the historic problems of bigotry in a country that was founded on slavery. Then Krystal also undermines herself when saying it depresses her how actual massive protests also don't get anything done.
This is the part that I find really disheartening. Even when you have a mass protest movement that has a lot of justification behind it, as the Black Lives Matter protest movement did, largest mobilization in history, and it didn't result in a single change at the federal government level. That is what I guess I find more depressing than the fact that there's, some action around the Dave Chappelle special.
She spent this video like shitting on how small the protest is, how it doesn't really look good optically, but then saying when there is mass movements of larger groups, it also doesn't get things done. But I doubt you were telling people who stood up for Black Lives Matter, I doubt she was saying like this was pointless, but apparently when it's transgender people protesting Netflix, it's pointless because it's small. Like I said before, Vietnam War protests, absolutely massive. Most Americans were against them. Most Americans supported the war. Would you tell those people to just push for like universal healthcare or checks and balances on the war powers of the president? One final point. Again, I don't know if Kyle is an anti-capitalist, but then he talks about like trans employees demanding the money, but saying Dave Chappelle worked hard to get his position and they want special treatment.
Then you actually cannot say that you're in favor of equality, because the reason why Dave Chappelle got his payday of however many tens of millions it was, right, is because he worked his way up from like the 1990s until today and was a stand-up comedian the whole time, paid his dues, and ended up making a lot of money. And to say, well, just take the same amount of money, I don't know what it is, let's just say 30 million, right? Take that amount of money and give it to various trans creators. What you're saying is, I want to treat them in a special way, not just an equal way. Like, if there's a trans comedian who works their way up and then they get that contract in the market, then that would be wonderful. That'd be great, and we'd all support that. But you can't just say, just pay the trans comedian or whatever the amount that Dave Chappelle, the #1 comedian in the world, made for his special. Because then you're not saying you want equal treatment. You're saying I want special treatment. I want to jump the line and just get what the #1 has simply by nature of the fact that I'm trans.
To me, that doesn't seem like transgender employees want special treatment. It seems like they want to readdress the balance of Netflix, which they've doubled down on, by the way, having these transphobic exclusive specials of Dave Chappelle, and they want to actually project, a positive image of trans people into the world using this platform and using their platform to make demands. So that is it for all the videos. So here is my summary. Like, in general, I don't think Kyle is like the worst person ever or the worst voice on the left. Especially if you get like your international relations and foreign policy stuff, I feel like he's a lot better than this stuff. But I don't think you can boil everything down in politics to both electoral politics and class. You have to recognize that cultural issues go beyond class. Like Ben Burgess was saying, like, no ethnic studies, just universal healthcare. This view is totally ridiculous. I come from a country of universal healthcare. I come from a country that has better employee protections than the United States. Is this country less racist? I mean, it's really up for debate. Maybe slightly, because it doesn't have the legacy of slavery at home, and slavery was banned earlier, and the laws in this country are so old they weren't written with like racism and slavery in mind. But culturally, it's still extremely, extremely racist to non-white people. Things like medical racism, things like the perceptions of various Muslim groups, things like the perceptions of transgender people. Just passing universal healthcare is not going to change perceptions of this stuff. Please tell me what economic policies are going to change people's mind about critical race theory and cultural Marxism. Please tell me. This is a war for culture, and it's annoying because the conservative culture war is mostly bullshit. That doesn't mean you should just shy away from it and try and focus on like universal healthcare and things like that. You have to kind of engage with it to help change people's mind, because like with class reductionism, not everything just boils down to the working class versus the bourgeoisie and the elites and things like that. Sometimes you got to recognize that, especially with historical precedent, whether that is like, the caste system in India, which is technically illegal but still has massive ramifications, and whether that is racist, white supremacist, settler colonial nations like the United States or Israel or Canada or Australia, or just like straight up racist countries like the United Kingdom, you have to recognize that history, that culture has seeped into like the very foundations of these countries, the very fabric of these nations. You cannot get rid of people's prejudices and racism, which they've been indoctrinated and brainwashed in from like birth, by just giving people universal healthcare, by just giving people £15 minimum wage or $25 minimum wage. That's not going to solve things. It might decrease them a tiny bit because, like I said, you won't have that scapegoat of like the migrant worker, But again, how is it going to change people's cultural perceptions of other people? The main thing I would say to these guys, walk and chew gum. You can pursue like a sound electoral strategy that is a big tent philosophy and try and get people to vote on economic issues. I remember reading an article about like the racists who voted for Obama, but at the end of the day, you cannot discount from your activism the cultural battle you have to fight. You can't just say like, oh, well, that's identity politics. I don't want to engage in identity politics. That just divides us. Then how are you ever going to get rid of racism? How are you ever going to solve bigotry? You're not going to solve it through universal healthcare and worker co-ops. So anyway, that is it for the video. Thanks for sticking with this one. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, come join my subreddit. Check out my Patreon if you want to support my work. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.